All right, welcome back. We are moving on through the brain PowerPoint, and we have entered, oops, I don't want that. We have entered the brainstem regions portion of the presentation. So last time we talked about a variety of things, including cerebrospinal fluid circulation and meninges and whatnot. And now we are doing brainstem regions. So let's just go ahead and organize this stuff. So we've got the midbrain, which is in green here. So I'll just, oops, point at that. So the main regions of the midbrain are what the arrow is on, which is the cerebral peduncle, and then these two little guys, which are structures that are part of a group of things called the corpora quadrigemina. We'll discuss those as well. And then in blue, we've got the pons, and in this salmonish color, the medulla oblongata. So we will discuss aspects of the function and shape of all of these things. So let's get at it. Sorry, I wanted to get all of my text on the page before I started talking. So we're going to go from inferior up. So the medulla oblongata, although it's small and it looks kind of visually unremarkable, it does a lot of really, really important things. And this is one of the reasons why brainstem injuries are so devastating for patients. Because if you lose specifically autonomic function, your ability to self-regulate and maintain homeostasis just is in the toilet. So unremarkable visually, very important functionally. So specifically cardiovascular, respiratory, and digestive system activities. So some of the nuclei that are responsible for initiating contraction of your diaphragm to inhale live in the medulla oblongata. There's a cardioacceleratory and cardioinhibitory center also in the medulla, and that helps modulate your heart rate. And there's various digestive system sort of centers that are involving gut motility, how fast your food moves through you, vomiting, etc. So lots of important functions in the medulla. Now, importantly, it contains both ascending and descending tracts. So let's just be responsible about terminology and take some time to check in with it. So we've talked about the ways that we refer to the direction the action potentials are traveling. So this is a newer one that you haven't quite seen yet. Ascending means going up. So you can think of ascending and afferent as being synonymous in this case. And then descending is efferent. So we have sensory and motor. So the descending tracts are numerous, but one of the most important pieces of the medulla oblongata contains descending motor information, and the ascending tracts are just as important as well. They're going to help coordinate reflexes and responses, among other things. So let's look at what those vital functions include, shall we? So first, let's talk about nuclei, and not nuclei of a cell. And so like what's pictured here, see all these little colored balloons? It looks like a clown party in there. They're not really that color, of course, it's just the illustration so you can tell the difference. But definitionally, a nucleus in this context is a group of neural cell bodies. So I like to just use the word neurosomata, which is plural. It's just easier than saying cell bodies, it's just one word. And glial cells and unmyelinated axons. So when you see a nucleus surrounded by white matter in any of these structures, just think of it as a processing center. So this is where neural pools and networks, talk to each other to compute some response. So autonomic nuclei, meaning these are part of your non-voluntary functions. So I mentioned the reticular formation last time. This is a weird sort of confusing network of of nuclei. So like this yellow one, it starts here, but you can see it goes up, 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 up. And that's because as it ascends through the brainstem and into the cerebrum, it expands and goes all over the place. The reticular formation is evolutionarily a very, very old formation that governs a lot of ancestral reflexes that we still use today. So one of those is alertness or awakeness. The reticular formation does a bunch of other stuff as well involving sleep, which is pretty cool. So we'll talk about that also. So I mentioned the cardio acceleratory and inhibitory centers already. So those are going to determine rate. Strength of beat means how hard the heart is contracting. So is it casually squeezing or is it slamming shut? And via the influence of blood vessel diameter, blood flow. So the respiratory rhythmicity centers are also in there. So you have an example, I'll just give you an example. Dorsal respiratory group, which is responsible for inhaling. So that's obviously really important. So that is connected, unsurprisingly, with the phrenic nerve via the vagus nerve. And so this is a really critical piece of the medulla involving keeping you alive. There's also centers coordinating throat and pharyngeal reflexes, so swallowing, coughing, sneezing. You have a lot more muscles in your throat and neck than you might think, and coordinating all of those is really important. And then I mentioned the descending motor information as well. So the pyramids on the anterior surface of the medulla oblongata are the location where those descending motor tracts decussate or cross over from one side to another. All right, so the pons has a lot of different functions. So we'll talk more about the pneumotaxic and apneustic centers next term, but just to give you a wee preview. So they adjust respiration rate and depth. So this is number of breaths per minute, but the pneumotaxic and apneustic centers do that by prolonging inhalation or inhibiting medullary respiratory centers. So the pons and medulla are talking to each other to regulate your breath rate and depth, and this is also achieved. So if you're going to prolong inhalation, by definition, you'll also be breathing in for longer, which creates a deeper breath and slows down your respiration rate because you have to take the time to do additional inhalation. So an example of that is if you are watching somebody fall asleep, you'll notice that their breath rate becomes very deep and steady and slow and even as they drop into actual sleep. This is partially the responsibility of the pons. There's also a cerebral peduncle, which is right here, or excuse me, cerebellar peduncle, and that is just a set of tracts, so represented here, that coordinate information between the cerebellum, the pons, and the rest of the brain. And then there's also all kinds of other tracts there. So this little table here is a summary of all of that information. Okay, midbrain. The midbrain is one of my favorite things to talk about. I think it's an underappreciated piece of the puzzle. So I mentioned the cerebral peduncle already. So peduncle is one of my favorite words in anatomy and physiology because it's silly and funny to say, but what it means is a piece of neural tissue made of tracts primarily that connect one piece of the brain to another. So in this case, the cerebral peduncle connects midbrain and tracts ascending from the pons and the medulla to the cerebrum. So similar to the cerebellar peduncle, which you can see here on the back of the pons, we've got cerebral peduncles. This is the cut edge of it, which are carrying ascending and descending information between the brainstem and the cerebrum. They also have the corpora quadrigemina, which are basically full of nuclei that process visual and auditory stimuli. So the cortices, that's plural of cortex is cortices. Anything ending in X, the pluralization is ICES, so vortex, vortices. It's a fun kind of pluralization style. So the cortices on the surface of your cerebrum include locations like the occipital cortex and the temporal cortex, which are the primary location where visual and auditory information respectively are processed. But that's complex visual and auditory information. So decoding the basilar membrane to determine or detect frequency, or sending the information from the cones of the eye to the color center in the occipital lobe to figure out what color you're looking at, those kinds of things. Um, the corpora quadrigemina are responsible for much simpler visual stimuli. So we'll look at that in the next slide, but I do want to kind of break this complicated word down. So corpora means bodies, quad, four, gemina, twins. So the bodies of the four twins. So let's have a look at those and what the heck that means, because that's a confusing one. So there's four twins, two per side, and there's a superior and an inferior colliculus on each side. So the superior colliculus, so let's here and here, is going to coordinate reflexes that respond to visual stimuli, and specifically your head and neck responses to those visual stimuli. And these are reflexive, meaning not voluntary, and they're very basal. So it's not processing complex visual information. It's more like something in the visual field suddenly changed, or I detected a movement all of a sudden. And in response, I'm going to whip my head around to look at that movement. The inferior colliculi, which let me pick a different color for these, are also reflexive and in response to a sensory stimulus, but instead they're auditory. And again, head, neck, and trunk. So what these two things have in common is the following. If there is a sudden noise or movement, especially if it's loud or intense or big, you reflexively orient toward it. So think of a time when you were startled by, for example, maybe a car backfiring or some sudden loud noise. You probably jumped and turned your head, neck, and torso in the direction of the sound. And you probably didn't take the time to think about it either. You weren't like, a stimulus has occurred to my left. Let me go ahead and rotate my torso. Nope, you just jumped and looked. So this is a really adaptive behavior, and there's a reason that it's reflexive. Ancestrally, early hominids, so Homo sapiens, but just a long time ago, they lived on primarily desert plains where large predators, like lions, leopards, or even earlier saber-toothed tigers and such, coexisted with them. And so if you hear a rustle in the grass that you cannot see, it's important and adaptive to rapidly orient to it because it might mean death is coming. So if it's reflexive and coordinated reflexively, that confers an evolutionary advantage because that means that you are able to orient to the sound and then skedaddle and maybe like climb up a tree or grab a rock if you need to. And the same thing for visual stuff. So if you're looking at a visual field and there's a sudden movement where there wasn't before, that could mean predator, or it could mean that there's a prey item that you can find and eat. So these reflexive orientations have a very important survival advantage, which is why that they still exist. So that's kind of what they do. Oops, sorry. So the other thing I wanted to mention about this, because it's always good to make clinical connections or real life connections to help this all make sense, is there was, my older students will probably remember this, younger ones may not. But there was a woman named Terry Schiavo. I think it's spelled like that. Anyway, Terry Schiavo had some kind of a brain injury. I can't remember exactly what it was. It might have been a stroke or an aneurysm, or maybe she got into an accident. I'll look it up right now. I can't remember the cause of her injury, but this woman was brain dead. So she was on life support, but there was no higher cortical activity. There's no there. Your frontal lobe is where your personality lives, and that none of that was intact. So she was technically alive and not on a ventilator, really, but she didn't have any higher functions. So um, she's a famous case because her husband, after keeping her on life support for a long time and hoping and praying that she would come back, um, eventually he decided to take her off life support. And there was a problem because her parents insisted that Terry was still alive and locked in there, and essentially wanted to oppose him taking her off life support. Also, I just looked it up while I was talking. She had a cardiac arrest. Um, so she had a heart attack, which meant that her brain was ischemic or lacking oxygen in blood for quite a while because of her heart pumping problem, and had massive brain damage that left her comatose and then after that in a persistent vegetative state. So Terry's parents said, no, she's in there somewhere. And they had this giant, very public legal battle with Terry's husband to try and prevent him from taking her off life support. And one of the arguments that they made was that Terry appeared to orient to visual or auditory stimuli. And that was their attempt to say, there's somebody in there. She's in there somewhere. She's doing this reflexive stuff, so obviously that means that she's just trapped in her own body. And really what was happening was higher brain function, no brain waves detected in her cortex, but the superior and inferior colliculi were still functioning. So none of that was conscious. It was all unconscious and not having to do with her being trapped in her own body, but rather just these basal functions persisting because the brainstem wasn't as damaged as the cerebrum. So that is a piece of medical news history that relates to this. Okay, there's also the substantia nigra, which means black substance. So this is called that because if you fresh section a midbrain and look at the cut cross-sectional surface of it, or I guess it would be transverse section, what you're going to see is white matter tracts primarily, and then there's this weird, actually black substance, it looks like soot almost, inside the neural tissue. And so when scientists first discovered this, they were like, wow, that's a head scratcher. Let's try and figure out what that is. So the substantia nigra is an important dopamine factory. And one of the reasons that it looks black is because dopamine and melatonin are on a similar or related, or excuse me, melanin are on a similar and related biosynthetic pathway. So on the way to producing dopamine, there is this substance created that actually is black, and it's called neuromelanin. So that is why you're seeing this intermediary of the dopamine synthesis process, which happens to be pigmented black. So the substantia nigra inhibits the activity of the basal nuclei. So these are going to be a set of nuclei. They used to be called the basal ganglion, but of course ganglion is in the PNS, so we don't call it that anymore. So basal nuclei coordinate patterned motor activity. And specifically what they do is they provide an inhibitory function to prevent unwanted movement in addition to the movement that you're intending to do. So let me just address unwanted movement very, very briefly. So one thing that we don't teach you in A&P here, but is relevant to know, is that we've taught you that action potentials only happen in response to stimulation, and that's not actually true. All of our neurons have some basal rate of spontaneous depolarization, usually in response to just like the shifting of the ion concentration. Uh, and so they'll just fire an action potential for no reason every now and then. But because we have all of these nice inhibitory and pre and postsynaptic inhibition functions, um, normally we don't see the outcome of those spontaneous depolarizations because they are damped down by our brain and our nervous system. However, if you take the inhibition away, which is what happens when the substantia nigra is unable to inhibit the activity of the basal nuclei, then you get unwanted movement. So in Parkinson's, this manifests as, at least in the initial stages, you can do an action, but it's accompanied by these tremors resulting from unwanted movement due to disinhibition of basal nuclei. So what Parkinson's is for whatever reason, the substantia nigra just stops making dopamine. It's like, yeah, I'm tired. I'm not going to do that anymore. So your case study relates to the relationship between Parkinson's, dopamine replacement drugs, and addictive behavior. So that's super interesting. I won't go into it more here because I want you to discover it in your case study. But just hint, hint, this is part of the answer to that. So if you're my student and you're watching this, make a note of this because I've just given you a big clue. Okay, and then the red nuclei issue subconscious commands for upper limb position and muscle tone. So tone, again, is a resting state of partial contraction that basically just assists your motor control of your upper limb. So the reason that the upper limb position and muscle tone get their own sort of nucleus is because the way that we interact with the world, because we're using our legs to walk, is mostly by using our upper limbs and maintaining appropriate muscle tone to use our brachium, upper arm, our antebrachium, our forearm, and most importantly, our wrists, hands, and fingers. Okay, the reticular formation. This is a doozy. It does like everything, as you can see. Oops. So this is a ascending formation, so you can see it here illustrated in orange, right there. And it actually goes up into the cerebellum as well. So it spreads out to have tracts that connect, but it's no longer cohesive at that point. So it just kind of goes poof. So this is consisting of both nuclei and tracts, both. And it influences the autonomic functions that are primarily coordinated by the pons and the medulla oblongata. So you can imagine that the reticular formation, since it passes through the pons and the medulla, it's going to send out afferent and efferent signals that connect it to the respiratory centers, the cardio-acceleratory inhibitory centers, and other centers of the pons and the medulla, and it even ascends and helps regulate thermoregulation via both skeletal muscle and its influence on the hypothalamus. It regulates muscle tone, which helps us remain upright. It also is involved in skeletal muscle reflex activity, specifically as it relates to basically reflexive, so like things like the hypnagogic, oops, I can't write for some reason, hypnagogic jerk, which is not a person. It's that, you know, when you're falling asleep and you're descending into sleep and suddenly you're like, ugh, and you jerk your whole body, that. So it also contains the reticular activating system. So activating means activates you, and it causes and maintains alertness or awareness of your surroundings, consciousness. So the reticular formation is interesting for the following reasons. Essentially, what it does, and this is we first learned about this, royal we scientists, just by observing people with injured brain areas that included injury to the reticular formation tend to have issues with alertness and attentiveness, so sleep-wake cycles, etc. Um, so consciousness, mental arousal, just basically the opposite of sleep. You're very aware, alert, alive, enthusiastic. So this alerts the cerebral cortex to incoming sensory signals. So the cerebral cortex is, of course, going to get the sensory signals eventually, and then the thalamus is going to send those sensory signals to their appropriate cortical location. But what the reticular activating system does is says, hey, you're about to receive some sensory signal. And that's basically functioning as a warning. So a sensory signal implies that something in the environment is changing and that we might want to pay attention to it. So that is really, really important because it responds to visual, auditory, and cutaneous, so touch, and then hearing and sight. Visual, audious, and cutaneous stimuli, basically to say, hey, you're being touched, or hey, a sound happened, those kinds of things. So what is theorized about the reticular activating system, and very, very well supported by experimentation and science, is the following postulate. So we observe this in animals too, because animals' sleep and wake cycles differ from ours, and that makes it really good to study theirs and compare and contrast to kind of learn what those things are for. Essentially, again, going back to ancestral humans who lived on plains, and even further back to our ancestors who were hominid-like primates who primarily lived in trees and slept in trees. We can observe this kind of behavior like in gorillas who build huge nests and sleep in trees to avoid predation, and chimpanzees do kind of the same thing. So essentially, if you are sleeping and you're sleeping in a tree, it would be good to not fall out. And if you're sleeping and you're sleeping in a tree, it would also be good to not fall out of the tree as well. So you want to strike some balance. So the reticular activating system and that hypnagogic jerk is basically a adaptive sort of system in place to help you A, avoid falling out of a tree as you fall asleep, and B, if there is a rustle or you get touched or there's a sound, wake you up and be like, hey, a stimulus is happening. I know you were sleeping, but it might be good to wake up for a second because something bad might happen to you if you don't. So it's a very basic and very old ancestral brain structure and function, but it's super interesting because it's in place to, again, basically help us survive and our ancestors survive. All right, so the cerebellum, this one, oops, does a lot of different things, but one of the things it does is adjusts postural muscles. So these are the muscles of your, for example, trunk. So your abs, your back muscles, your erector spinae, also the extensors of your legs, etc. So things that are allowing you to maintain an upright position and to balance. And these are things that you don't notice consciously. So basically your cerebellum is checking in with your motor control of your postural muscles and just tweaking them so that you stay upright. So it modifies that resting state of partial contraction. So another thing that the cerebellum does is basically it involves fine motor control. So instead of reading you these bullet points, I'll let you read them yourself. I'll just describe kind of the basis for this, and then I'll show you a little video about what happens when you don't have these functions in the cerebellum. So when you initiate a movement, and if you want to know more about initiating movements, go watch the motor control video on the short videos A and P topic by topic. I go through motor commands and control all the way from the precentral gyrus down to the actual sarcomere, walk you through it all the way. So that would be a useful thing for you to know. or you can listen to the How to Point Your Finger episode of the podcast. So when you move, proprioceptive organs in your limbs or in whatever you're moving are sending signals. So if I stretch my arm out, my Golgi tendon organ is going to detect how much stretch or not stretch my tendon is experiencing. And I also have the muscle spindle, which is detecting the extent to which my muscle is stretched. And I have action potentials running through my muscles via the motor units. So those proprioceptive organs, the tendon organ and the muscle spindle, are going to send sensory or afferent information back to my brain to say, hey, this movement is happening and here's how it's going. This amount of stretch is happening, we're doing this amount of contraction, etc. And my brain, via the cerebellum, is going to make sure that what I'm actually doing matches the motor program that I formed in my frontal lobe. If it doesn't match, the cerebellum is allowed to make fine adjustments. So it goes ahead and tweaks the movement a little bit to smooth it out, sort of. So this is what I mean when I say compares intended movement with actual movement. And so this is really important for basic fine motor function, which is to say the cerebellum isn't in charge of initiating motor function, but it is heavily involved in refining it. So if you don't have a cerebellum or you have one that is underdeveloped, there is a specific result to your movement ability. So I'm going to pause and bring up a video here so I can show it to you that relates to cerebellum. And I promise it's not sad, it's cute. All right, so we're back. So what you're seeing is a kitty. And for some reason, probably due to inbreeding of cats, purebred cats especially, very inbred. I'm a cat lover, so no shade. I'm just saying, like, when humans are trying to achieve the cutest cat, one of the outcomes is inbreeding, and that creates problems, obviously. So what we've got here is a cat with something called cerebellar hypoplasia. It's also adorably called wobbly cat syndrome. You'll see why. So if you don't have a cerebellum, you can still initiate and execute motor commands because the rest of your motor system is intact, but that checking in with motion and seeing how it's going and tweaking it function that the cerebellum does, not present. So you get motion, but it's motion that is very wobbly and uncoordinated. So see, this cat has a very atypical stance, and that's because the postural muscle control for this kitty is impaired, so she has to kind of do this tent stance in order to maintain upright. So now you're going to see her try and walk. And see, she's walking, but it's very wobbly and uncoordinated. So she trips and falls a bunch. But, you know, she's happy. She's happily wandering around in the yard. She's just doing it kind of uncoordinated. And you can also see that she's really using her tail for balance in a way that most cats would not. But she's still able to move. She's just wobbly. And so Nodia, this cat, oops, she fell down. There you go, get up, good kitty. She has a relatively mild case of cerebellar hypoplasia. There are some cats that have more severe cases where movement is more impaired. Oops, I fell down. But regardless, the wobble kitties are very cute regardless. And so, you know, if you have the opportunity to foster or adopt a cat with cerebellar hypoplasia, I recommend it. They're so adorable. It's just a little bit wobbly, that's all. And there's another kitty with cerebellar hypoplasia, which is just a little bit milder than Nodia's, but as you can see, they're still having a good time being cats. So, marvelous. No harm, no foul there. So I have to drive to work now. So I'll see you guys in a little bit. So I'm going to end this segment of the video and let it upload while I get ready to drive to work, and then I will see you guys in lab. So the next video, we will talk about the functions of the diencephalon, which are numerous and interesting. And then after that, we'll finish up the PowerPoint and move on to the next one. So thank you for your attention, and I will see you in the next video. Adios.